7244.
Welcome back to Winnipeg Direct on Shaw, the show that looks into big issues, current events, and concerns that affect Canadians. I'm your host, Megan Duffy, and joining me on the panel is Liberal leader Dr. John Gerrard, Mike Brown, PC candidate for St. Vital, and Jeff Perrotty, City Councillor. The basis of our next discussion revolves around the 2011 federal budget, recently announced by the Harper Conservative government. The Harper government has allocated $2.2 billion for Quebec transition towards the harmonized sales tax, which has yet to be finalized in a final agreement. The HST has been a political hot topic in recent years, with voter backlash against the harmonization of provincial and federal sales taxes. British Columbia has adopted the HST. However, the provincial government was forced to promise a mail-in referendum on the issue. So, Dr. Gerrard, first question at you. Do you think Manitoba will ever get HST?
Well, it's likely to come. I mean, the political reality, because if you've got every other province in Canada, and it's down to just Manitoba and Saskatchewan who've got an HST, then we are likely to be at some point in a position where it's just not going to be workable to go without it. However, I mean, with an election coming up, political parties are included, are staying away from it, and it's a reality that we may have to deal with at some point.
Jeff, how do you think people in this city will feel if we do have HST?
Well, nobody wants to pay more taxes. I mean, that's a given. The problem with the current separate systems is it's a lot of work for small businesses. It's a lot easier to submit one payment, to have the same collection rules on this and that. I mean, if you have, a 12-pack of donuts, there's PST on it but not GST, or maybe it's GST and not PST. It's complicated. A lot of things when you're bringing them in even across the border. Canada Border Services Agency won't collect PST on clothing because there's a difference in the rules. They don't charge PST on children's clothing under 12, so you don't pay it at all at the border. There's a lot of differences in it. I would make things a lot simpler for people. That said, I mean, a lot of things that you don't pay PST on today would be applied. So again, I wouldn't just say add 7 and 5 to give you a 12% tax. If it was a 10% harmonized tax, we should have that discussion with the public should have that conversation. I mean, right now you get a haircut, you only pay GST, you don't pay PST. You would pay a harmonized sales tax, for example. If it was 10% instead of 12, people may accept it.
Mike, how do you feel about HST? Do you think Manitoba needs it?
Well, business leaders say that they like the idea, and again, because it simplifies things. I mean, what's happening in BC may be a bit of a skewed representation because the BC government had been around for a long time. This may have been just the thing that kind of tipped them over into the point where they may lose government. But I'm not sure if that's as big an issue there as what it will be in years to come. I mean, will people rail against it forever? I don't know. I think Ontario has it now. Do they not as well?
Yes, Ontario does have it.
Ontario does have it.
Quebec is close. The compensation coming from the federal government is simply to help the transition, and it's valuable money for provinces that otherwise wouldn't have this to harmonize. And if we're the last to harmonize, we're going to have trouble trading with other provinces. So if the country's going this way, then it would be wise for us to look at it earlier than later. Otherwise, we'll be trying to figure out at the border how GST and PST works across borders, and then we look like the odd man out. So if it's coming, we better get ready and have a look at it now instead of burying our head in the sand, because we have to look at these things as a possibility instead of just sort of pretending they don't exist.
Dr. Gerrard, what's the Liberal standpoint on HST?
Yeah, we're not going to, in the short run at least, introduce an HST. Now, I mean, I think that part of the problem here is that the NDP have been kind of deceptive in presenting the problems with the HST, but not presenting some of the advantages. And the other thing is that there has been, there's a big savings, right, for businesses in a harmonized sales tax. And what should happen is that the costs which are saved by businesses should be passed on to consumers as lower costs.
How do businesses save?
Mostly in their paperwork. If they're dealing with one tax, they can submit their tax forms to one place with one tax, one register column. It's a bit of an accounting nightmare.
No,
really, that's what it is.
Actually, the most of the money that's saved comes from the fact that on a GST, businesses get a rebate on the inputs, right? In other words, if they buy something which would have a GST on it, then they will get that money back, so that they only pay GST once, as it were, on the final product. But with a PST, very often businesses are paying the PST now on their inputs to their businesses. And so the businesses benefit because after a harmonized sales tax, they get a rebate for all the PST that they were paying.
Another big difference for municipalities is we actually get a refund for all the GST we spend on providing municipal services. At this point, the province of Manitoba does not refund the PST. With an HST, there's certainly that opportunity, even with the current PST. I'd be remiss as the municipal guy in this group here to not bring that up.
So, Dr. Gerard, the Harper government wants to cut $11 billion in the next 3 years. Do you think that's feasible?
Well, I was there in the 1990s with Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien, and we made some fairly dramatic changes, and we were able to balance the budget and, in fact, make sure that the economy started growing, that the number of jobs increased, and there was a real turnaround in the economy after we were elected in 1993. And that was good management.
Having said that, in fairness, part of that budget was balanced on the province's health transfers.
Well,
and you got to be careful with that.
The interesting thing, Mike, is
the Tories have a tougher job if they're going to do it without doing that, and that's what they say they're going to do, is to try to do it without putting it to the provinces.
What you have to remember, right, and there's a lot of scurrilous NDP politicians who tried to make hay out of this, is in the 1990s for Manitoba, which is a less well-off province, we increased equalization, right? And so that the actual transfers to Manitoba never decreased, right? A lot of people blame the federal government, all right, of the 1990s for some of the shortages, all right? And the fact is that the overall transfers never went down. And in fact, under the Liberal government over those 10 years, there was a doubling of the federal transfers to Manitoba. I mean, it's an interesting perspective, but it's actually the reality. And so that what has to happen is that, yes, you've got to protect particularly the less well-off provinces.
Right. Who also need to start protecting
Manitoba.
themselves as well by being a little more aggressive.
But I think that, there's, having been there in the 90s and looked at what's happened, for example, in Manitoba under the NDP, that there's a whole lot of areas where we can, in fact, be spending a lot more wisely.
Well, federally, I mean, if we look at this as a whole, I mean, give the Liberals their due and the Conservatives their due, we in Manitoba have had 10 very good economic years and somehow managed to get deeper in debt as a result. And our transfers are as high as they've ever been.
Yep.
And there doesn't seem to be a way out of that. And that's the worry. I mean, you talk about federal budgets, provincial budgets, we're about to run deficit, likely again. Our debt keeps rising, and there doesn't seem to be an end to that. So if the federal government can get their house in order, that's great. But we, as a province, we could do better.
Yeah. There's some important starting places provincially. I mean, one of the things that Paul Martin did, and he was very good at it. I mean, he set a budget for each department at the beginning of the year, and he said, "Look, that's your budget, right? No more, no less. And if you spend a little less, we'll let you carry that over till the next year." But what's happened here in Manitoba is that every year, of course, the NDP have set in their expenditure budget, and every year, by the end of the year, they've overspent it. They've never been very good at managing the expenditures, and that has been led to part of this problem. Their cumulative overspenditures over the 12 years are now almost $2 billion. And if that hadn't been there, we would have not, much less of a problem than we do now in terms of the deficit we've got in Manitoba.
Now, Jeff, many people fear that there's going to be major cuts to social programs, education, and maybe even health. What are people in your area saying about that?
Well, again, I take the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister at their word that transfers to social programs to the provinces and transfers to individuals are not on the table. There's excess bureaucracy within the system that is ripe for cutting, and that's in fact where the cuts are going to be made. As far as I can tell, they've got a 4-year window, but again, I think that's going to slip before they start cutting transfers to families, to provinces, and that for social programs.
But we have to be careful on transfers too, because Ontario has already said they're not happy that they're supporting the rest of the country, us being one of the big ones. And I'm sure Alberta isn't far behind. And if those two provinces say, listen, we want nothing to do with the transfer agreement, we're in trouble. I mean, we are so overspent as it is now that we would just fall deeper and deeper into debt. I mean, we just barely balance the books now or less, and we just keep going.
I get provincial press releases many times a day, and I mean, it's the TAPs are just, they can't say no, it seems like, at the NDP at this point.
And you have to prioritize. There has to be some priorities. I mean, and people say healthcare is a big deal. And I think we could all agree that that's the case. But
Healthcare is a huge deal.
It is a huge deal, and we need to focus it as our main priority and fund it adequately instead of funding everything. You can't have it all. It's like your house, your budget at home. Sometimes you have to say, I can't afford to go to the movies tonight.
Yeah. I mean, if you take the provincial perspective, there's approaches that we can take. For example, if we prevent health problems like diabetes, right, we are actually saving a lot of healthcare dollars. And that's the most efficient way to actually start doing better and smarter on healthcare.
So if the Liberals were in power, sorry to interrupt you, what would they cut? Would it be social programs? Would it be education? What do you think they would cut?
Well, let's turn it around, right? Because if we decrease, all right, if we have an effective approach, which the NDP have never had, to the diabetes epidemic, we decrease the number of people with diabetes. We don't have to spend quite as much on healthcare, or we don't see as big an increase. If we look at, let's give you another area, which is important. When we're looking at transfers for employment insurance, when we're looking at quite a number of the social programs, they depend on, how many people are working and how many people are not working. And so that if you can manage the economy well, so that we have more people working, then in fact, what happens is that you have lower costs for some of the social programs. Let me give you another example. One of the big costs that's been going up provincially and federally is in justice, in building more jails, in putting more prisoners behind bars. And some of what's happening provincially doesn't make sense, because 70% of the people that we're putting behind bars are there now without ever actually having been convicted, right? Because our justice system is not working very well.
Well, that's a whole other topic for a whole nother day. But sadly, that is all the time we have here on Winnipeg Direct. If you have any hot topics of your own, check us out on Facebook or Twitter. Send us a message. Thanks for joining us. I'm Megan Duffy, and you're watching Shaw.
The opinions expressed on the program you have just watched are not necessarily those of Shaw Cable Systems or of this station. Through our access policy, we provide the opportunity for community groups and individuals to express their points of view.